if you'll open your Bibles with me and turn to the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 26. Come on, quite a journey through the book of Matthew over the last few months. It's surprising how much ground we've been able to cover. In fact, skipped a few chapters just for sake of time to go from the birth of Christ until his resurrection in the times between when we celebrate the birth of Christ and his resurrection in the year. And plan to do this next year with the book of Mark, and the next year with the book of Luke, and the next year after that with the book of John, and we'll start all over again, you know? And that sounds good to me. I like it. But we've connected our celebration of Christmas with the celebration of the resurrection in this way. And here we have, we come to Matthew 26, the end of Matthew 26. Near the end, we're going to begin in verse 57. And we're going to look at the trial, what I've called the trial of the judge. Here's Jesus, who for the last 3.5 years has proved without a doubt that he has the right to claim to be the Messiah. I mean, you can go all the way back to the beginning of the ministry of Christ, when the lame man was lowered to him through the roof. And he turned to the man and he said, "Your sins are forgiven." And the Pharisees said, "You can't do that. Only God can forgive sins, because sins are crimes against God. So only God can forgive them." And Jesus said, "I know. That's why I said it. And so that you know that I'm not just saying this, that I actually have the authority to say this, so to prove that I can say this." He turned to the man and said, "Rise and walk." And the man stood up and walked. He was there because of the 4 of his friends who brought him. He wasn't faking things. He wasn't making stuff up. There were eyewitnesses that could testify that he was genuinely paralyzed and now he's genuinely risen and able to walk. And Jesus predicated the whole thing on this statement that he could forgive sins because he was God. He had that authority. And then he goes and he casts out demons. When I was to cast out demons, you know, he doesn't go and say, "In the name of the God of Abraham, I command you to come out." He says, "I tell you, come out." And the demon had to leave. Why? Because Jesus, on his own authority, had power to cast out demons. Because he is God. He's been proving this for 3.5 years. He's healing the sick. And then he goes and he raises the dead. And this is an event that takes place just prior to our story, just a few months before the story that we're going to read here in Matthew chapter 26. Jesus goes to a man named Lazarus who's been dead for 4 days, and he says, "Lazarus, get out of that grave." And Lazarus says, "Yes, sir." And he walks right out. And Jesus has now showed without any doubt to everyone around that he has the authority, if he wants to claim to be the Messiah. Now, it's very clear that he is the Messiah. But he's gone beyond that, right? He's made it clear that he has the authority of God himself, that he is God. And then he enters into Jerusalem, fulfilling the prophecies of the Old Testament, riding on the donkey, and everyone says he's claiming to be the Messiah. And they say, "Hey, Hosanna to him that comes in the name of the Lord." He's the Messiah. They recognize it. And when the Pharisees come and tell him, "Do you realize that they're claiming that you're the Messiah? Tell them to stop." He says, "If they stopped, the stones would cry. This has to be done. They have to call me the Messiah." And Jesus said, when the children came and called him the Messiah and the Pharisees complained, Jesus said, no. Out of the mouth of babes, I have perfected praise. Meaning, what they're saying is perfectly true and correct. I am the Messiah, and they need to declare it. Jesus has, without any uncertainty at all, proved that he has the authority and the power to claim to be God and the Messiah, and then he claimed to be so. But this has created a real anger and animosity among the leaders of the Jews. They are livid So angry that you can't even believe it until we start reading this passage, how angry they are. And sometimes it's hard for us to understand why. Why are they so angry? Well, it might help to understand a little bit about what's taking place in Israel at the time. There is a high priest named Annas. Now, the high priest would have been the highest position in the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel has been conquered, like every other nation of their time, by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire controls everything. And but they leave the nation of Israel to mostly govern themselves. They just put a governor named Pilate there in the land to make sure everything stays peaceful and that they continue to submit to Rome. But otherwise, they can govern themselves. So the highest leader among the nation of Israel is this man named Annas. Now, Annas was known for, he sort of had established a mafia sort of a presence in Israel. I mean, he was the mob boss. He was the godfather, you know. He controlled everything. As a matter of fact, they called, you remember the story when Jesus goes into the temple and he casts out the money changers in the temple. Those money changers were part of what was known as the Bazaar of Annas. Annas, the high priest, had actually set up this extortion system in the temple. And when you came to the temple, for instance, you would want to bring an offering. You'd either bring an offering of money, or you'd bring a sacrifice of a goat or a lamb, or something to sacrifice on the altar. If you brought an offering of money, your money would be Roman coins. That's the money that everyone used. But since the image on the coin was the image of Caesar, they would say, you can't bring that into the temple because it's idolatry. Caesar calls himself a god, and there's an image of him on the coin. So you've got to exchange that coin for a temple coin. And, of course, what they would do is they would make quite a profit off of this exchange. For instance, if you brought $100 in Roman coin to exchange for a temple coin, you'd probably get $50 a temple coin. What would happen with the other $50? Well, Annas would get that. You know, he was skimming off the top in exorbitant rates. And then, if you brought your own lamb to sacrifice at the temple, your lamb would have to be examined by the priests, and of course, the priests all answered to Annas. And chances are, your lamb would not be good enough to be sacrificed at the temple. They would find some blemish or something that they could say, no, we can't take this. You'll have to go take your money, exchange it for temple coin, and then buy with that temple coin an extremely high-priced temple animal that has already been pre-screened for you. And you can go and sacrifice that. So they would end up paying 3 or 4 times the price for a temple animal. And who would get the money for that extra that was paid there? Well, it was Annas. Annas had an entire criminal organization. That's why when Jesus entered into Jerusalem on the donkey, he rode on the donkey, and the first thing he did after the crowds claimed him as the Messiah, Hosanna to the Son of David. Where does he go? He goes straight to the temple where he had been at the beginning of his ministry and cast out money changers. And he again cast the money changers out a second time. Now that he's proved that he's the Messiah, he has the authority to do this, he says, make not my house. You've made my house a den of thieves. Literally, the home of a mob boss. The home of the Godfather is right here in the temple. Now, by the time that when Jesus first cast out the money changers, Annas was the high priest. But what happens in Israel is that Annas is growing in so much influence and power that he controls basically everything. And the Romans don't like this. So the Romans kick him out of the high priest's spot. And they have to choose another high priest. Well, this is completely foreign to Israel. Israel has high priests until they die. They aren't supposed to, the only time you switch to a new high priest is when the old one dies. But in Annas' situation, the Romans insisted and removed him from high priest. But Annas made sure, because of course he controlled everything, that his son-in-law Caiaphas became the next high priest. So even though Annas is called the high priest in certain places in Scripture, because you keep the title high priest until you die. But he's not in the position of high priest at this moment in time when Jesus is going to be put on trial. However, he is most certainly behind everything that's taking place. He's the one who's running the show. And all of this takes place because Jesus is cutting in to his prophets. Jesus has come in and now twice cast the money changers out of the temple, and the people are saying he's the Messiah. This is going to hurt Annas' bottom line. And you don't do that to Annas. He's the Godfather. He'll make a deal for you that you can't refuse, you know. So this is the setting in which we find the Sanhedrin who meet together after Jesus' triumphal entry and his casting out of the money changers in the temple. These guys meet together and they say, we've got to kill him. And the one who brings them to the conclusion that he's got to die is Caiaphas. Of course, right? He is completely controlled and beholden to Annas, who runs and makes so much of the profit of the temple money changers. So all of this sort of sets the scene. This is all the background for the trial we're about to see. They've already decided that Jesus is going to die. And they first tried, we saw this in chapter 22 of Matthew, they first tried to get him to trip him up in his words. If they could only just get him to slip up and make a mistake, if only they could show that he wasn't perfect, like everyone knew that he was, then they wouldn't have to put him on trial. They wouldn't have to kill him. They could just show that he was wrong, that he was false, that he was a heretic or whatever. And they could just dismiss him, but they couldn't. And because they couldn't get Jesus to slip up in his words, they finally decide, we've got to kill him. We have to kill him. Now, what you also need to know, this is fascinating, and these are things that I completely missed for the majority of my time in study until I found them. I said, man, this is an amazing thing that adds so much understanding to this. The Israel's system of justice was, at this time in history, unique in the world. Today, it is the the Hebrew system of justice system that is the foundation for most civilized countries, the justice system in most civilized countries today. Our justice system is based on the Old Testament, the Hebrew justice system that was originally begun by God. They were so specific. Let me explain just a few things that they had to do in order to find someone guilty, especially guilty of death. They had to have a public trial. This was absolutely 100% required. They had to have a public trial. They had to have a trial that was in daytime hours. They had to have a trial. They couldn't even have a trial for someone, especially if they were a trial that could result in them being worthy of death. They could not have a trial near the end of the day, lest the investigators be rushed to make a decision and to interrogate all the witnesses. They had to have it at the beginning of the day, and they had to have a public trial in a public place. Matter of fact, they had the Sanhedrin Council, the Great Sanhedrin. Each town that was large enough to have, I believe it was 140 families, would have a Sanhedrin. If your town was, bigger than maybe about Weare, New Hampshire's size and bigger, I guess, then you would have a Sanhedrin Council. And but these were smaller councils. And then you had a Supreme Court, if you will. The Great Sanhedrin met in Jerusalem. This was 70 men plus the high priest, so that way you had a tiebreaker. You had 71. And they would determine the great matters of the law. And what would take place is that if somebody was accused of something, they had to have a public trial, and there had to be witnesses. Now, they were very specific and particular about what witnesses could testify in a trial. If you're going to testify in a trial that for which, if they're convicted, the person was going to be put to death, then you, who are testifying, would have to be the one to put the man to death. If you can't lift a sword, if you're too old or too young or whatever to put someone to death, you couldn't testify in a trial that would result in someone being put to death. That's how particular they were about this. In fact, if it was found that you were a false witness in a trial where somebody was going to be put to death if they were convicted, you would be put to death. You would receive the verdict that you sought to give to someone else if you were a false witness. We actually find this in the Bible, and we may have time to get there before the end of the sermon today, where I can show you this is actually based on principles from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says it specifically about how they also couldn't take witness from just one person. They had to have two witnesses, and those witnesses had to agree. They had to remember the year and the day and the hour when the thing took place. And if they disagreed on even the slightest detail, their testimony was thrown out. They could not take the testimony of one witness that disagreed with another. They had to have two witnesses that agreed together. It is so much that when they examined all the witnesses, after all the accusation was brought, the council would not prosecute the case. They would hear the case that was brought to them. And once they've heard the witnesses, the person on trial would then have to be given a chance to bring his witnesses. This is something like what we have today. And the witnesses would be sworn in. They used a different swearing in phrase than what we, the statement than what we use, but they use a swearing in sort of a statement. And they admit that before God that they wish the same penalty on themselves if they are telling falsely. And then they were not allowed to, the council was not allowed to bring a verdict on that day. Once they've heard all the testimony, they had to fast and wait 3 days before they'd come back and give a verdict. Now, after 3 days, they would come back and they would give a verdict, and if the verdict was guilty, the man would be marched away to enact that sentence right away. Especially if it was a death sentence, he would be put to death right away. But they had to have 3 days in between where they're fasting and praying to make sure they make the right decision. And if they, in finally counting up the votes, if somebody wanted to change their vote in the council, if a council member had voted guilty, he was permitted to change his vote to innocent. But if he voted innocent, he could never change his vote to guilty. Too late. Too late. We don't want to accidentally put someone to death who there's some sort of corruption or something going on here. And then when they were on their way, they would march out of the courthouse, the trial place, and they would march to the place where they would put this man to death. And what they would do is there would be someone standing in front with a standard, with a flag, and someone in the back, and there would be someone pronouncing as they went, as this progression went, this is so-and-so, he's going to be put to death for such and such. Does anyone here have any more evidence that they can add? We'll go right back to the trial if anyone has anything else. And they had someone in the front of the procession and someone in the back who would wave a flag if anyone met that procession at any point along the way and had more information. They would turn around, they would go right back to the trial, they would hear the whole thing again. And the man himself who's being marched to be put to death, he could say, hey, I remembered something that I forgot to share that could clear me. And they would say, all right, turn around. They would go right back. And Josephus writes that this happened no less than 5 times. They would give him at least 5 times to just stop the whole procession. I remembered something. Turn around and go back and have a trial again. Just to be sure that everything was done correctly. I mean, they had a system of justice and mercy. They were very careful because they knew that according to the Old Testament, God required the blood of murderers at the hand of the government. He requires that blood at their hand. And they were to enact justice. They had to do it. They were not to, accidentally put to death the wrong person. So they were very careful. They were known for their justice system. No nation on the earth at this time had anything like that. And even today, we don't have anything quite like that exists in the world today. They were known for their purity and justice, which is going to give Annas a real hard time putting Jesus to death. Because he's got to put him to death. And yet his whole system of justice is going to have to be thrown out the window in order to do it. And let's read what happens here We know that Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane when they take him. They wanted to take him when the crowds weren't around because the crowds thought he was the Messiah. And it says, verse 57, and they that laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, we know from the book of John that before they took him to Caiaphas, they first took him to Annas. They first take him to Annas, who's not the high priest anymore. And he's in the house of Annas. And Annas asks him a bunch of questions about his disciples and what he teaches. And Jesus says, I taught openly. Go ask the people who I taught. You see, Annas is trying to find something to accuse Jesus of that is worthy of death. He's fishing, and he can't find anything, and he's expecting Jesus to give him something that he can try to then accuse him of. And it doesn't work because Jesus isn't speaking to him. Jesus is a sheep dumb before her shearers. He's not opening his mouth. He's not speaking in his defense. He doesn't need to defend himself because there's been no accusation brought. They are fishing for an accusation. They bring him first to Annas to see if Annas can find something to accuse him of. And Annas finally gets frustrated with him and sends him on to Caiaphas. You can read that in the book of John, as I said. But one of the other important elements of a Jewish trial was that the person who was being accused of something that's worthy of death, he could not be convicted on his own testimony. It doesn't matter if he confessed to the crime. He could not be convicted based on his own testimony. They had to throw that out as evidence, his own testimony. And so here's Annas trying to get Jesus to testify against himself, but that wouldn't have counted anyway in their court of law, which is why Jesus said, why are you asking me? You want to put me to death? Go ask the people who can actually witness against me. You're doing this all wrong. And so he doesn't speak. Then Annas sends him to Caiaphas, and this is where we pick up in Matthew, because Matthew is going to highlight the injustices done in this trial. Because remember, Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. So the Jewish people here are definitely going to notice the problems that are going to take place in this trial. Remember, this is the middle of the night. There should be no trial taking place. Even right before the night, there should be no trial taking place. But this is now the middle of the night. This is probably getting close to midnight. And he's now sent to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled. And now, notice what it says, verse 58. Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now, we know from John was actually there. John went right into the room where they were interrogating him. Peter stood outside in the courtyard of the palace. But this palace here is the high priest's home. You cannot have a trial in the home of the high priest. You had to have the trial in the place of judgment, in the judgment hall. There was a judgment hall where the Sanhedrin would get together. That's where you had to have the trial. It had to be public. They're having a private trial in the high priest's private home. And we see the injustice that's being taken place. Verse 59. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. Wait a minute. You're bringing him to trial, all the while you are seeking that somebody would witness something against him so you could have something to accuse him of? You have no accusation, but you've arrested him and brought him to trial, and while he's over there with Annas, you're out there trying to find somebody to bring up something that you could accuse him of. And here we have absolute rage. You can see the anger. I mean, when Jesus stands before Annas and he says, look, don't ask me, go find yourself a witness, the person standing next to him, the Annas' servant, slaps Jesus on the face. And Jesus said, hey, if I said something wrong, tell me what I said wrong. But they're so angry. How could you speak to the Godfather that way? How could you speak to Annas that way? How could you defy those who hold and wield so much power in Israel? And of course, Jesus, all the while he's on trial, knows, and we should know too, Matthew writes it so that way we can see, that the real judge is not Annas. The real judge is not Caiaphas. Jesus himself is the real judge. And what Annas and Caiaphas and the rest of the Sanhedrin are doing is condemning themselves before the true judge. While they think they are the judge of Jesus, they are actually bringing themselves into condemnation before the one who is the true judge. But notice this, in all of their rage, no doubt filled with demonic influence and maybe even some demonic possession, they are so filled with anger, they cannot find one thing that Jesus has done wrong. I mean, they're looking everywhere they can, and they can't find one thing. Listen, I'm telling you what, if somebody got really angry at me and searched everywhere they could for every kind of witness they could, I guarantee you they could find something that I've done wrong. They could find a whole list of them, right? 100%. Jesus is proved here to be the perfect Lamb of God because they could not find one witness that could agree with one other witness. And it says here that they're now searching for witnesses. They have Jesus in there questioning, and he won't speak. And they try to get him to say something to condemn himself. And they're trying to find witnesses. They can't find any. Verse 59, now the chief priests and elders and the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. So they found lots of people who were willing to come and say something, but when they examined that witness up against this witness, it didn't agree. They couldn't find any two that would agree together. What should have happened is that those witnesses then were put to death. That was the standard for Israel. But of course, the high priest wasn't about to do that. He was the one in charge. And Caiaphas was controlled by Annas. So here we go. Verse 60, they found that at last, it says, came two false witnesses and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. Now, in Mark chapter 14, we read a little more information about this, that the other witness is recorded in Mark chapter 14, it appears. Mark 14, verse 58. He says this, verse 57, and there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. Now notice the difference between those two statements. One said to him, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. Well, that's not a crime, saying you're able to destroy the temple and rebuild it. There's no crime there. And the other one didn't even agree with that. He said this, we heard him say, I will destroy the temple that is made with hands. Within 3 days I will build another made without hands. Of course, that's not what Jesus said. And if you look at the book of John, chapter 2, you'll see that he said, if you destroy this temple, meaning the temple of his body, I will raise it up again in 3 days. Which, of course, they're about to do, to destroy the temple of Jesus' body. And he's going to rise again in 3 days. So he didn't say that. And the two witnesses didn't even agree. Mark continues saying that neither did these two witnesses agree. And it says this, back in Matthew. Matthew chapter 62. And the high priest arose, meaning the high priest realizes he cannot get a witness to actually testify against Jesus. So he's going to have to figure something out here. Because they've already decided Jesus is going to die. They've already determined the verdict. They've already determined the sentence. They just have to find a charge. And so here's what he says. The high priest arose and said unto him, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace. Jesus didn't have to say anything because nothing had been accused of him. He's not been accused yet of any crime. And it says, Jesus held his peace, and the high priest answered and said to him, I adjure thee, by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Now, the book of Luke gives a little more detail, and it appears that these were two questions asked separately, and Matthew's putting them together because he asked both of them. But he first asked whether he is the Christ. And Jesus responded to that by saying that if he told him, he wouldn't believe him. He said, listen, if I told you whether or not I was the Christ, you wouldn't believe me. Now, that's an interesting response because the word Christ means anointed one. That means Messiah, the Messiah of the Old Testament. That's what Christ means. When they say, are you the Christ? What they're saying is, are you the Messiah of the Old Testament? Jesus realizes, of course, he knows all things, but he's looking at Caiaphas, and obviously, it's not a crime to be the Messiah, right? The Messiah was prophesied to come. How could it be a crime to be the Messiah if they're supposed to be waiting for the Messiah to come? It's not a crime to be the Messiah. Not even a crime to claim to be the Messiah, although it certainly would be wrong if you're not the Messiah. However, Jesus has already proved that he is. So that's nonsense. It's a nonsense question. And of course, Jesus has already given this answer. They have already asked him multiple times who he is. And he says, look at the works that I'm doing. What do you think I am? You know, people say you're the Messiah. They say, don't say that. And Jesus says, no, they're telling the truth. And they're like, well, we want to hear you say it. Say that you're the Messiah. And Jesus said, you're not going to believe me if I say it. It doesn't matter if I say it. You see, any old man could show up anytime, anywhere, and say, I'm the Messiah. You know, lots of people have said this. I was watching a documentary just last night about the Branch Davidians and I forget the name of the guy who was ended up burning down the whole complex and killing 80-some people or whatever, but he thought he was the Messiah. Right? Anybody can say they're the Messiah. Jesus proved that he was the Messiah. He didn't have to say it, but he did say it, right? So he says, it doesn't matter if I tell you, you're not going to believe it. By the way, you can find that in Luke 22 if you're looking for for that in your own study. But the high priest has adjured him, it says, by the living God. This is another very interesting statement in the Jewish legal system. Look with me, if you will, at Exodus 22. Exodus 22, we see the standard that was given. Almost everything here ties into the Old Testament. I'm not bringing you to every single verse, but there's many other verses that could be brought out here. Exodus chapter 22, and I believe it's verse 11, if I'm reading my own handwriting correctly. Here it is. Then shall an oath of the Lord be between them both, that he hath not put his hand into his neighbor's goods, and the owner of it shall accept thereof, and he shall not make it good. Now, many times throughout the law, the Old Testament law, including Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you find this oath of the Lord that's used. But when there was a contention, when there was something that needed to be agreed upon, the highest oath, the highest person that they could finally swear before would be God. They'd make an oath before the Lord, before Yahweh God. And here, the high priest says unto him, I adjure thee by the living God. This is the highest oath you can take. You have to tell the truth. Now, the high priest knows that Jesus claims to be the Messiah, and he claims to be the Son of God. So, he knows that Jesus is either going to lie, which would prove that he's not the Messiah, or he's going to say that he's the Messiah, and he is God, and then he's going to be able to use that as an accusation of blasphemy. Well, saying that you're God is blasphemous if you're not God. Okay? But Jesus is, so it's not blasphemy. Now, is it? Now, here's what it says in verse 64. By the way, after he asks if thou be the Christ, he says, the Son of God. Now, this statement, the Son of God, is very important. In Proverbs chapter 30, the words of Agur, he writes about God and he says, I'm the most foolish man around. I think I know about God, but here's the thing. I might know who laid the heavens, and I might know who put the stars in space, but I don't know what his son's name is. And what Agur is expressing is this frustration after reading the Old Testament scriptures and seeing Abraham talking with God in human flesh before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, seeing Jacob wrestling with God in human flesh, seeing Samson's parents meet God in human flesh, and then he ascends up into heaven. Like, Agur is frustrated with this idea because he's seeing the son or human form of God. God in human flesh in the Old Testament. Who's that? What is this? He's called Yahweh, but he's in human flesh. What is this in the Old Testament? Agur is saying. And here we have the statement in that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, Jesus has said this about himself. John chapter 5, we see this multiple times, but John chapter 5, Jesus calls himself the Son of God. John chapter 5, verse 18. And the Jews respond by wanting to kill him because he's made himself equal with God. He's made himself the Yahweh God of the Old Testament who showed up in human form. Look what it says in verse 18. Therefore, the Jews sought the more to kill him because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So in the Jewish context, it wasn't, oh God, Jesus is saying, I'm a son of God and that I'm created by God like any human is. No. When he says I'm the Son of God, he's saying, I am the God in human flesh that you saw in the Old Testament. He's making himself equal, and he's saying that I am God. And so, here we go. Here's the high priest. Are you the Christ? Are you God in human flesh? Are you the Son of God? Jesus says to him, verse 64 of Matthew 26. Jesus said unto him, Thou hast said, nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now that is a reference to the book of Daniel. If you'll go with me to Daniel chapter 7. Or you could just hang out there and I'll read it for you. Whatever makes it easier for you. Daniel chapter 7. There is a prophecy of the Messiah. And here's the prophecy of the Messiah. It says this, verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man. That's the Messiah, called the Son of Man. This is why Jesus so often calls himself the Son of Man, because he's talking about himself in the context of Daniel as the Messiah. I saw one like the Son of Man, came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. There was given unto him dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. Jesus turns this around to Caiaphas. Caiaphas says, Are you the Son of God? And he says, yeah, absolutely, you said it. But also, I'm the Son of Man, that Daniel said is the real judge in this scenario. Caiaphas there has this, little man, this puny guy that he thinks is a nobody. He's convinced that he's got to be just a vermin that he has to extinguish, someone who's bound in front of him, someone who seems weary from all night being up praying and weeping. And he says to him, you're nothing. Do you call yourself the Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus says, yep, and I'm the Son of Man. I'm the real judge in this room. I'm the one who's really in charge. And you are condemning yourself before me, is the implication. So, of course, the high priest is not happy with this response. Verse 65. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, Ye have spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? How about witnesses to testify whether or not he really has done works to prove that he's God, like raising Lazarus from the dead? How about giving him the chance of defending himself, which is what the legal system had to do? How about the fact that you can't bring a verdict on the same day that you've investigated witnesses? How about the fact that you're using his own testimony as evidence against him? How about the fact that you are doing this in the middle of the night? You're not even having a public trial. How about the fact that you're doing it in your own home and not even all the Sanhedrin are necessarily there yet? How about the fact that this is completely a travesty of justice, and it would have to be, because Jesus is the only perfect human being that has ever lived. and yet they found him guilty. This has to be the greatest travesty of justice that has ever existed. And it came from the Jews who were supposed to be the ones who were upholding and shining as a light justice to the rest of the world. Verse 65, the priest says, "We have no further need for witnesses. He said it himself. Blasphemy. Behold, now ye have heard that it is blasphemy." Verse 66, "What think ye?" They answered, "He is guilty of death." They didn't wait 3 days. They weren't even supposed to be having this right before a feast day. The next day was the first day of unleavened bread. They weren't allowed to have a trial before a feast day because they were supposed to fast for the next 3 days. So they aren't supposed to be doing this on this day anyway, let alone in the middle of the night. Verse 67, "Then they did spit on his face." I want you to understand, this is something that we can often miss. These people are absolutely filled with rage. They are so angry at him right now. They are spitting. I mean, here's the Sanhedrin council, the pillars of justice and righteousness in Israel. And they are so enraged by Jesus, and perhaps even influenced and filled with demonic possession, that they are spitting on his face. They're so angry that they cannot find a charge, that they cannot control the situation like they are so used to doing, that they cannot be the lords over the Messiah. They spit on his face, buffeted him. Now that word buffeted means a closed fist punch. And we know from the book of Mark that they did this with putting a bag over his head so he couldn't see what was coming. They punch him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands. That's the open palm, saying, "Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee?" I mean, if you've ever seen one of those videos that they captured of a mob just out of anger, kicking someone and beating someone, this is what's happening right now among the Sanhedrin council of the Jews. You call this a impartial trial? I don't think so. Can you imagine saying, "We have impartially decided that this man is worthy of death. We've investigated all the witnesses. We found none. And we did it in the middle of the night. And don't notice the fact that he's all beat up and spit on. We just got a little angry at the end." This was not impartial even a little bit. This was the biggest travesty of justice that's ever existed. Now, Peter is on the outside, and you see that Peter is sitting outside, and we see that from verse 69 through 75. We talked about Peter and Judas in our last sermon on this subject. But look with me in verse 1 of chapter 27. We'll close here. We'll try to do the trial before Pilate next time. Verse 1 of chapter 27. "When the morning was come, all of the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death." So they're done. They beat him, they spit on him, they mock him, they make fun of him for the rest of the night, throw him in prison, and then first thing in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, when the morning started for the Jewish calendar, they get him out, and now they have an official trial. And they all just say, "Send him to Pilate, he's worthy of death." Now they have the official trial. They hear no witnesses. They don't wait 3 days. They ignore all of the rest because they already did their due diligence over the night when nobody was able to watch them. And now they're sending Jesus on to death. But we find this all throughout the scriptures, that Jesus is the coming judge, that Acts says that God has appointed a day in which he will judge all of the world. Every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess to Jesus. But look at Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31. This is one chapter before this. By the way, this is all throughout even the book of Matthew. The principle that Jesus is the judge of all the earth. But just look at Matthew 25 verse 31 as one example of this. "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, he shall sit upon the throne of his glory. And before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. I mean, Jesus is the judge. And Caiaphas has just made himself a goat. Right? The real trial here was not a trial of Jesus as the judge. It was a trial of the judge, Caiaphas. And he was found guilty. Jesus was doing what he had to do. He was suffering sin, though he knew no sin. That was my trial that he was condemned for, because he didn't have to go through it. He went through it because I'm a sinner, because I'm guilty, because I deserve the cross. He is the perfect Son of God. He is the judge. He died for Caiaphas. He died for Annas. He was not answering their charges because, one, they had brought no charges, and two, he had to die for their sake. Not that they would take advantage of the salvation that he would purchase, but it was offered to them. He died for the sins of the world, while the world put him to death. He came into his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. What will we do with Jesus? Jesus is still on trial today. But yet, what we choose to do with Jesus doesn't determine what he is. Some atheist who says, I don't think Jesus is the Messiah, doesn't make Jesus not the Messiah. It makes the atheist a goat who's headed for hell for eternity. I don't think Jesus is God. That doesn't mean Jesus isn't God. You're not the judge. He is. What you do with Jesus determines your verdict, not his. Determines your guilt, not his. Father in heaven, as we consider the travesty that took place on that day, when you stood before the hordes of Satan as they moved the Jewish people of that time, the Sanhedrin Council, to lash out at Jesus with hatred and spit, injustice all the way through every single bit of it. We think of this, we are torn, knowing that you didn't have to suffer any of that. You are the just judge. You are perfect. And yet you did it all for us. If there's no other thing that we can do today but just walk away from here with a greater appreciation, a renewed appreciation for the salvation that you purchased for us. And thank you for that. If there's anyone in this room, or I pray if there's anyone in this room, or even under the sound of my voice, maybe online or wherever, that has not made a decision with Jesus, that has not decided that Jesus is the Lord, may today be the day that they run to him for salvation. Because their decision does not determine the truth. It only determines what Jesus will do with them. Lord, help us. Help us to declare Christ to a lost world.